So now we're going to move on to the next session, which I'm really excited about. It's a faculty-led panel. It's called Genetics. It's personal. DNA is all about you, your evolution, ancestral immigration, and genetic profile. This panel will explore the ethics and policies surrounding genetics, along with some of the business models and educational applications that are in use today. We have a great panel, including Chip Aquadro, who is a Charles A. Alexander Professor of Biological Sciences in the Department of Molecular Biology and Genetics at Cornell, and Director of the Cornell Center for Comparative and Population Genomics. Anna Faaborg, class of 03, is a Research and Disease Community Manager at 23andMe. Julie Granka, class of 08, is Manager Personalized Genomics at AncestryDNA. And Andrew Smolik, class of 09, is also a product manager at 23andMe. Chip first visited Cornell when he was 12 years old for a Cornell alumni university. His father was Cornell engineering class of 46. Fond memories of that trip catalyzed an instant attraction to Cornell years later when Chip was offered a faculty position in 1985. His daughter Christine is Cornell class of 03, and his son Brian is Cornell class of 08. And they both married Cornellians, so that's a lot of Cornell connections. I'm guessing another generation still to come to Cornell. Anna fondly remembers running through the pouring rain with her boyfriend, now husband, to retrieve a favorite earring lost during a Chai Notes concert in Barnes Hall. When not at work, Anna can be found keeping her 1.5-year-old son from wrestling with his 6-year-old brother. Julie recalls proudly on a bet eating half of an expedition sundae at Purity Ice Cream. For those of you that don't remember, that's 2 warm brownies, 1 warm chocolate chip cookie, 8 scoops of ice cream, 3 sundae sauces, 4 candy toppings, whipped cream, and a cherry. She and her friend won that bet. She is grateful to Cornell for introducing her to population genetics, the focus of her professional endeavors, using genetics to learn about population history. And finally, Andrew remembers citing Bill Nye on campus walking nonchalantly to class and is thankful to Cornell for his many Cornell alumni connections. When not at work, he can be found hiking and camping in the Sierras. Please join me in welcoming the panel.
Well, thank you. We're delighted to be here, and this is a real neat opportunity for us as Cornellians and for us to share some of the things that we're particularly excited about with regard to genetics and its implication for society and for humanity in many respects. Now, what I want to do first is to take just a moment to kind of set the stage and remind you that, in fact, all of us are, that's the next, oops, go back one, sorry, there we go. Remind you that you're all geneticists in a sense. You all are the product of a cross, essentially, or have progeny, and as well have progeny that contribute to the next generation. So you're part of this family of individuals, to a father, a mother, and children here. Well, essentially, populations are groups of families. And over generations, those individuals, again, accumulate more lineages passing down. And sometimes we look at one particular DNA sequence in one individual at one point in time at the top, it's passed down by chance to several different individuals, 3 different individuals here. And if we look at that particular sequence and follow it even further, down over time, through the population, generation after generation, we see that one black dot is now present in 5 individuals at the bottom. Now, this transmission of genetic information from one generation to the next is fundamental to the inheritance pattern in all organisms. What's of interest is that if we take and start with a single sequence at the time, every generation we pass a DNA sequence from one generation to the next, there's a certain chance of basically mutations occurring. And those mutations accumulate as we move down through time on these sequences and, in fact, accumulate differences that we can then see in the sequences at the bottom. Now, this is important for a couple reasons, because some of those mutations actually are things that cause disease, and they're inherited by the individuals in which that mutation first occurred. And likewise, we can actually move back upwards. We'll spend a good deal today talking about moving back upwards from those sequences at the bottom to infer our relatedness, who we're related to, and our evolutionary history paths. Now, the study of this in the field of population genetics over the last several decades has led to a picture that's really revealed a remarkable history for humanity. All of us basically emerged in Africa and spread out of the Africa for many of us into the Central Asia, spreading to the west and to the east in waves of migrations around the world that spanned a period from about 60,000 years ago to as recently as 10,000 years ago, founding the North and South Americas and the native communities. This led, in fact, to leads to a remarkable sort of picture on which, if we sample our DNA sequences now, we can actually paint ourselves back on that history that we've learned about. Okay. Now, what I want to do today is focus, at least for a little bit, on some of the genetic testing offered by two different direct-to-consumer companies. These are companies in which you yourself could basically go on your computer or your phone, and you can log into their website. You can submit your credit card, get a kit sent to you, and in fact do some testing of ancestry. Just out of curiosity, how many people in the audience here have actually participated with genetic ancestry tests? Okay, so we have about maybe a tenth of the audience. That's great. Okay, so what I want to do is turn to our panelists here and I'm going to ask first Julie Granka at AncestryDNA, what is the AncestryDNA product and how does it work and what do you offer?
Excellent. So if you advance to the next slide, I like to show this slide as sort of an example of how we can learn about ancestry from your DNA. So Chip talked a lot about how your DNA is passed on. This is an example of showing how language is passed on and how that can also reveal about where you're from. So how many people here use the word soda to describe a sweetened carbonated beverage? All right, so most of you are probably either from the Northeast or from California. How many of you guys use the word pop? A few of you. You guys probably most likely come from the southern United States. So just because DNA is passed on, language is passed on as well, and we can use how it's passed on to learn about your history and learn about where people might be from. So if you go to the next slide, it's showing how when DNA is passed on, we can use that to learn about your ancestors because your DNA is sort of a mosaic of the DNA that you got from your ancestors. And how you share that DNA with your relatives means that you also share that DNA from some ancestors that you have in common. So use these two basic principles at AncestryDNA and also at 23andMe to tell you about where you came from and who you might be related to. So the next slide is an example of my ancestry estimate from AncestryDNA. It's sort of a breakdown of 50% Eastern European from my dad's side. My mom's from Italy, so I have the Italian as well as Caucasus region of the Middle East. So it kind of gives me a broad picture of where my ancestors might have lived hundreds to thousands of years ago. The other very neat feature of the AncestryDNA as well as 23andMe tests is we'll take your DNA and compare it to everyone else in the database. At Ancestry, we're currently over 3 million people, so that's a lot of people comparing you to and looking to see who you might be related to. So the next slide is an example of my results. I can find out that my parents are my parents, my sister happens to be my sister, she's in the audience today, and using that DNA to connect you with relatives, some of whom you knew and some of whom you didn't know as well. And for genealogists who make up a large part of of the people in our network, they're really interested in using this information to learn about where they came from and learn more about their ancestors.
Thank you, Julie. Andrew, so tell me about what is 23andMe's product? What does it do and what do you offer?
So 23andMe is a consumer genetics company, and essentially we have 3 pillars as part of our company. So the first one is research services, which helps partners like NIH or education institutions or pharma companies do research and conduct studies with consenting participants to use their phenotypic and genotypic data. And phenotypic is survey data, and then genotypic is their DNA results. So that's the first part. The second part is our therapeutics division, which they use our, again, consenting user data to find drug targets and potentially work on drug compounds. And then our third, which is best well known, is our direct-to-consumer business, which is essentially collecting samples from our users and returning ancestry and health reports to them. So the actual process is you get the kits, you basically provide a saliva sample, and then it goes off to the lab. In a few weeks, we return reports both on ancestry and health, and this gives you an idea about your background and also things like your traits like hair color, eye color, and then also carrier status reports.
Great, thanks. So in both cases, there's a component of genetic ancestry involved. Julie, why are people so interested in learning about their ancestry?
That's a good question. I think I mentioned sort of one area is people who are maybe really interested in their genealogy, really interested in trying to figure out, really trying to narrow in on their family story. So maybe they have some stories that have been passed down to them that maybe they've descended from some Native American princess, or maybe they think their ancestors came from a certain part of the world. And so I think a lot of the interest in DNA testing for ancestry is to really see if a lot of those family stories are actually true. Oftentimes they're not, but sometimes they are as well. So I think there's really a curiosity in seeing if, giving some evidence to what has been passed down in the family lore. And so I think, there's also this fascination with where do I come from? And if you look on YouTube, both for 23andMe, Ancestry, people post YouTube videos of them viewing their results for the first time. And they're really funny because people be like, wait, Mom, I'm African? What? And the mom's like, yeah, you're African. You didn't know that. So there's some really interesting videos out there. People are really just excited about kind of really learning more about themselves. And then I mentioned this other aspect of the testing we provide, which is to show how you're related to everyone else in the genetic network. And I think that's really exciting for people to see. They know their immediate family and some of their extended family, but they may not really realize how many people they actually are related to when you keep going back in time and realizing that you share a lot of ancestors in common with a lot of people. So in our database of around 3 million people, we've identified over 20 million connections between people at less than third cousin levels that's sharing a great-great-great-grandparent. So it's not too far in the past. And so I think there's also this exciting aspect of seeing how really we're all interconnected with one another. We share a common history, as Chip showed, from Africa into the rest of the world, and it's really evidence of that shared story.
So let me touch for a moment on taking this a bit further, rather than just directly to consumers, to actually thinking about using these kinds of approaches and companies' products in the classroom. So I teach a course developed several years ago called Personal Genomics in Medicine at Cornell, and it's a course that is aimed at non-majors, and so it's taught for students that come from many different majors. In fact, they come from about 30 different majors right now across all 7 undergraduate colleges at Cornell. And the focus is really on learning about genetics and why it's meaningful to you, why it's personal, and why it actually matters to know something. And we do take and use genetic ancestry as basically a tool for understanding the basic principles of genetics and making the information real to them, thinking about what does informed consent mean. In order to participate, they have to sign informed consent forms. We only do the ancestry part of 23andMe's product, and that's what we've done this year. Actually, this is 130 kits. We were deciding what to do with them before we tested all the students, so we sat down with a couple of my students and spelled out Cornell, which actually turned out to be a little tricky to do. The boxes aren't exactly square, and they kept tipping over all the time. But nonetheless, we had fun. Now, the interesting thing in this class is that we have a really enormous diversity. There's 130 students. They, again, sign up just simply because they're interested in learning something about genetic ancestry and about medicine and how genetics impacts that and the kinds of ethical, legal, and social challenges that the material poses. And it's really been fun because in this class, every year, as I say, I offer voluntary participation in doing genetic testing, which I raise funds for, and the university contributes some as well, to actually make it possible for every student, regardless of financial need, to be able to actually do it. And the pictures that emerge in terms of the ancestries are really quite remarkable. So this is the results from last year. The cap last year was 100 students, and you can see the enormous diversity of backgrounds in which ancestries were represented in. I just have a number of different groups listed here. It's too small there, I'll look up here. Again, continental Europe, 55%, Middle East, North Africa, 4%, Sub-Saharan Africa, 11%, South and East Asia, 29%, and Native American, 1%, with different fractions there within. So really a remarkable picture of a landscape of diversity, and I think it reflects both the intent of the university to attract students from around the world and the fact that our world today is a much more fluid and dynamic pattern of movement. Now, there are students that occasionally choose not to. Last year, there were 2 students that chose not to do the testing. It turned out at the end of the semester, when they learned all about things, they said, geez, they wish they had done it. But in fact, what I did is ask 2 colleagues if they would be interested in being tested, and 2 of those colleagues are shown here. You might recognize one or both of them. Mike Kotlikoff was very enthusiastic to participate as well, and also Gerard Acking, who was the director of the Africana Center last year and professor of Romance languages. I'm just going to show briefly the pictures that emerged from these 2 individuals. With regard to Mike, his results were consistent with what he sort of expected. His father's family was from Russia and the Ukraine. His mother's family was from Austria, and he identifies as Ashkenazi Jewish. That's what he thought was his ancestry, and that's pretty much largely what his ancestry reflects. In fact, the large diaspora out of the Middle East of individuals of that heritage. Gerard Acking's ancestry was, in fact, remarkably diverse, and it reflects the fact that he was born in Trinidad, and his relative, or his family, in fact, he knew had come fundamentally from Asia, Asian India, basically Europe, Africa, as well as Native American ancestry. And in fact, he views this as one of the most remarkable pictures of the emergence of and survivorship of people that fundamentally survived one of the major labor experiments of society ever. Because in fact, this was movement by the British Empire of individuals literally around the world to fund, basically to support the sugar plantations in the Caribbean that brought together this enormous diversity of people, and it really leads to the rich cultural and genetic heritage ancestry in these particular regions. Okay. So this is the sort of fun part about it, the ancestry part about it. I want to turn to the question about, can direct-to-consumer tests also drive advances in medical research? And I want to turn to Anna, since this is your area.
Yeah, so I work on the research team at 23andMe, so I work very closely on our various research partnerships that we do with pharma companies. And one of the keys to being able to make progress in this space is big data, having a very large group of consented individuals participating in research. And beyond just consented to participate, it's this idea we're talking about, like the recontactability. Right? Oftentimes, researchers will get a group of people, and they'll ask them a bunch of questions, and then they'll sit on their data and analyze it for a year, and they'll say, oh, I really wish I had asked that one more question. So we have that database of over 1 million participants. We can go back, we can ask them questions. We have their genotype, they keep coming back to access their results, new relatives that come up. And so that has given us an opportunity to do some really amazing science. The core of it is optional consent. Everyone knows, they're very transparent about what they're signing up for. And as a basis of this wealth of information that we have, we formed our own therapeutics group, because this opportunity to say we can start with human genetics, and it's been shown that drugs that have a human genetics component incorporated in the very early stages of development can move to the market up to 2 times faster. So there's really exciting opportunity there. As one example of a contribution we've made in the understanding of disease, it's a collaboration we did with researchers at the Broad, starting prion disease. There was a couple, and the woman was affected. She had a mutation in the prion gene, and her mother died of the disease, and she was very terrified. What does that mean for her? And we looked in our database, and what we actually found is the mutation she had is much more common than would otherwise be thought. And what that means for her is having that mutation is not as terrible as you might think, because there are people who at this point would have developed that disease who have not developed it. So that opens up new areas of research. Why are those people affected and others aren't? And there are many other examples of that type, but I just thought I'd highlight some interesting work that's been done in the area.
Great, thanks. Julie, on the ancestry side, are there aspects of pushing forward in sort of research areas that you were pursuing?
Definitely. So Anna discussed sort of the medical research that's being done with databases of a huge size, and we can do the same thing by looking at ancestry and population history. So in Chip's field and my field of population genetics, we can use the genetics of populations to learn about the past. And in most cases with genetic research, that past is thousands of years ago. And what we recently may have been actually able to do with our database is combining the network of over 3 million people with the pedigrees that people have traditionally input on ancestry.com for a long time. We have information about where people were born, when they died, where they moved around throughout their lives. If we actually pair those together, we can actually get a very remarkable picture of the history of very present-day United States. And so this is we recently published a research paper as a team trying to understand about recent population history from genetic data. And so I think it really highlights, to highlight Anna's point of big data, of as we continue to obtain more and more individuals in their samples who are consented to participate in research, we can really learn a lot not only about medicine, but also about just where we all came from and kind of doing it in a way that hasn't been done before, which is really exciting as a population geneticist.
Right, I agree. And I think it's important to note, too, that the whole aspect of ancestry actually turns out to be very important in actually trying to understand the genetic basis of many diseases. Because, in fact, unless you know the genetic structure of populations, you may make an association that you think is due to a biological explanation, when, in fact, it's just simply a sampling from different populations. So Andrew, what's the biggest impediment to customers understanding their results?
So that's a good question. So 23andMe's health product is an FDA-regulated product. So we spend a lot of time making sure that our customers have a very good understanding of what we're providing. So essentially what we first do is identify the key parts of the report that we want the users to understand. And then we have two pretty powerful tools to basically confirm this. So one is the qualitatives, and that's essentially interviewing users to make sure that we can basically watch them use the product and ask them questions about why they're understanding something or why they're not understanding something. So that's at the sort of individual level. And then we have quantitatives as well, which is essentially surveys, which basically gives us an idea about the trends across a larger group of people. And we basically iterate between these two to hone in to make sure that we have basically a representative population has a good understanding of what we're trying to convey. And then the last part is making sure that we have a very high comprehension rate while also returning interesting and compelling results to the end user.
Julie?
Yeah, so in addition to sort of the educational aspects that Andrew mentioned, making sure that people kind of understand what genetics is and what it could tell about them. I think another area that people are often confused with when they get their results is they say, well, this is based on my DNA, so it's fixed, it's static, nothing's changing. And I think a really important thing to highlight is the work that we're doing at both companies and other direct-to-consumer companies. It's based on research that's being done in academia, and it's sort of cutting edge. What are the best ways to estimate where people are from? What are the best ways to tell people that they're related to one another in the most accurate way? And that's ongoing research. And so, we constantly the work that my team does at Ancestry, we're the R&D team analyzing the data and making improvements to those results over time and making sure that people understand that their results are estimates and they're based on sort of the best information we have at a time. But the exciting thing is that you're sort of part of that research as well, and those results can continue to improve over time as we get more information. So I think in addition to the genetics, just understanding the basic genetics components to it, I think it's also understanding, that this is cutting edge research also.
Very much so. 23andMe gives in their health reports information that includes carrier status and things. So how do you follow up with regard to, how are they receiving that information about that they're a carrier for something? And what's the general perception or views about how people respond to getting what's potentially sort of worrisome news?
Sure. So the idea of getting worrisome news is something that 23andMe has looked at, as well as some academic groups. Robert Greene at Harvard, that's kind of his bread and butter. He loves studying how people receive direct-to-consumer genetic results and what they do with them. And he does this for 23andMe as well as Pathway Genomics and Navigenics back when they offered direct-to-consumer genetic testing. So it's something that's in publication, in literature. The current carrier status reports, again, having gone through the FDA process, we're not actively studying them, but what we can do is look back when we had some more health-related reports prior to the FDA letter, where we had BRCA mutation results and Alzheimer's results, and even pharmacogenetic results, which tells people how they metabolize certain drugs. We actually published a paper where we looked at individuals who received their BRCA1 and 2 status. So this is a mutation that gives them a much higher risk of developing breast and ovarian cancer for women. And so we looked at 26 people who had found out from 23andMe. So there were people who already knew, and we had them in the group, but people who just found out from 23andMe. And what we found is that all except one got retested from the doctor. They did not experience any increased anxiety. What actually resulted is 30 of their family members also got tested, identifying 13 additional carriers. And so all these people were now being monitored by their doctors, and they were aware of their risk. And again, their perception was not a negative one, it was very positive. Robert Green, again, has looked at people receiving direct-to-consumer results for very serious issues across various companies. And again, what he found was that people do not react any differently than they do getting the same information in a medical setting. What he actually found is that more than half, about 58% of people, do nothing with the results, which could be a whole different discussion panel. Of those people that do something, it's typically changing their diet, increasing their exercise, and anything regarding their medications, both prescription or not, they mostly go to their doctor. Less than 1% of people make any changes to their prescription medications without consulting their doctor. So this kind of sense of anxiety of what will happen if someone learns something about themselves has been studied, and it just has not been shown that there's this kind of mass alarm or concern. People are taking information to the doctor when they need to, and the system kind of works as it should.
Great. Great. So the direct-to-consumer genetic testing has been viewed by some people as sort of largely entertainment. But is that true, or has it really deepened the public's understanding of genetics and willingness to think seriously about that genetics? Julie, you want to answer first?
Sure. So I think there is a little bit of both. I think I mentioned sort of the fascination that people have with posting their YouTube videos, and so I think there is this entertainment factor. They like to share the results with their family. They share it on Facebook, or they get additional family members tested for the ancestry side of things. So I think there is this entertainment aspect. But I think the really exciting thing is that a lot of our customers are people that maybe haven't taken genetics since high school, or even maybe middle school in some cases. And now we're bringing the conversation about DNA to the dinner table, where they say, hey, I got my results, and here's what I got. And so I think even if there is this entertainment aspect to it and they don't understand all the intricacies of how our algorithms are actually performed and how they actually get the results that they get, I think it's really exciting that we're bringing DNA into casual conversation. We're highlighting the fact that everyone has DNA. It kind of makes who you are, and it's highlighting the fact that we all share DNA with one another to some extent. And I think through initiatives that I'm sure both 23andMe and Ancestry have, as far as educating the customers on the website, educating through other means in social media or online, I think that it'll continue to get better over time. And I think it's exciting to think about the future, where maybe everyone has either had a DNA test done or has been sequenced, and there's sort of a broader understanding about genetics. I think we're on the path there.
Great. Okay. I'm going to jump to Andrew and ask, what are the marketing difficulties for direct-to-consumer genetic testing?
Yeah, so there are a few that we faced. I think the hardest one is managing expectations, what users actually get. And to give an extreme example, there have been customers who called in and asked when they should expect their clones to be delivered to them. So that's an extreme example. But even just the type of reports that we return and what to expect in those reports is a challenge. So part of that is we educate people with our ads, also on our website. And something that we do in addition to that is when people actually purchase their kits, we make it really clear what type of reports they're going to get and what they should expect from those, which is, I think, different from, or it's unique to 23andMe. Another point is how much the product costs. So 23andMe has two products. One is Ancestry reports, and that's about $100. And then we also have an Ancestry Plus Health, which is about $200. And both of those are pretty high price points. $100 is more of an entry than the $200 product, but it's still a serious expense. And then lastly, essentially how we talk to our customers. So we basically run the gamut from quite young to quite old. So how we explain what the product is and what they should expect needs to be geared towards those groups.
Great. Do you think, Anna and Julie, that the direct-to-consumer movement and your company's efforts have made the public more accepting of genetic testing or more concerned about, wary of genetic testing? Anna?
Well, I think at a step back, most people still are not aware of genetic testing, right? They're not aware of direct-to-consumer genetic testing. So there's this whole group of people that we have the opportunity to educate about genetics and about this idea. And then for people who are, there are some people who are early adopters and super excited, and there are people who are wary. And what we can do for the people who are wary about the space is, one, prove that we are good stewards of data, have very strong privacy and confidentiality protections in place, very clear, transparent language in our consent documents. And also for 23andMe, showing them that direct-to-consumer can be done at a very high standard by going through the FDA process and getting clearance for some of our reports and kind of revamping the rest of our reports to match that kind of high bar of understanding from our customers.
So if I want to follow up with you and ask you, what's your favorite story of a customer who's learned something medically or health related from 23andMe and acted upon it by seeking further medical testing or treatment?
Sure. So customers run in with stories all the time, and this one I read recently really struck with me. There's a man, Greg, and his youngest son, when they introduced him to solid foods, they found that he just really rejected fruit. He pushed away anything that was sweet. It was kind of strange. If he did manage to eat something sweet, he would actually throw it up. So they took him to doctors, and everyone kind of said, well, that's really too bad, but we don't know what it is. And so years went on, and unrelated, Greg wanted to learn more about himself, so he did 23andMe. And the way he describes it, looking through his carrier status results, he saw that he was a carrier for hereditary fructose intolerance. And a light bulb went off for him. Someone with hereditary fructose intolerance doesn't have a protein that will break down fructose, which is the very common sugar in fruit and other sweets. He, as a carrier, did not have it, but it made him have his son tested, and sure enough, his son, who was 7 years old at this time already, was diagnosed with hereditary fructose intolerance. If untreated, hereditary fructose intolerance can lead to liver and kidney damage. But now that they had a diagnosis, his son's condition could be managed just with diet. And that was just this huge relief for the family to have answers and be able to do something about it.
Great, okay. So look, watching the clock here, I want to jump ahead a little bit and talk about and ask Andrew, what do you think, in your view, is the most untapped sector of the direct-to-consumer marketing or marketing in general associated with genetic testing?
Sure. Can we go to the next slide?
Sure.
Hopefully that will help. So this graph will basically help explain my views. Essentially, this is comparing Moore's law, which is the massive decrease in compute costs versus the also massive decrease in DNA sequencing cost. So when you have a powerful trend like this, it definitely opens up a lot of opportunities. It's still not clear what the killer app will be, but one of the ideas is beauty and wellness. So essentially adding a genetic component to help inform and hopefully provide better products via personalization. So one thing that 23andMe's worked on in conjunction with an outside party was essentially looking at stretch marks, and 23andMe was able to identify genes and then proteins which are associated with this, and potentially that could be used to make more personalized products or personalized recommendations.
I think if I'll add to that too, I think we're entering an exciting area. I think where the research that R&D teams do can really inform a lot of these new, exciting new products. But I think in a lot of cases, the science isn't quite there yet. And Andrew highlighted one case, but I think people often have an expectation that, oh, you can test my DNA and tell me that I need to take more of this particular supplement or something. And in a lot of cases, those correlations aren't quite as strong. And so I think it's going to be an exciting future as research continues and we learn more about how genetics really does determine how you interact with your environment and a lot of those factors. I think we're entering an exciting future, but so it'll be exciting what we'll see.
Yeah. I think it's worth noting too that many of these instances where an association is found between a genetic variant and a disease or a trait or something like that, one of the realities is unfolding is that the connection between those can be highly statistically significant, but it may only contribute a very small proportion of whether the likelihood of you actually having the disease or not, or whether you have a phenotype or not. And this is just the reality of the complexity of the genome, which again is an alphabet, I mean basically 4 letters, but it's 3 billion nucleotides long. So there's a tremendous amount of information that goes into encoding us, and the interaction with our environment shapes that and so forth as well. So I want to turn and leave a little bit of time here for some of the questions that are popping up on the screen down here, and pose them to the panel here. I guess the first question here is, does either company provide a public benefit? And I think, why don't I, Anna or Andrew, do you want to, maybe Anna, you can talk specifically with regard to some of the clinical trial type things.
Yeah, so one of the things that we focus on is understanding disease, and so we have large cohorts studying Parkinson's disease, inflammatory bowel disease, lupus, and as part of our goal for those projects and others is to publish. So we publish as much as we can. We make our data accessible to academics and other groups who want to come and, again, access data from consented participants. The question here is about specifically something like a bone marrow match. Those are very challenging things to do because they look at markers that may not be present in the genotyping platforms that we have. But as Andrew pointed out, as sequencing costs go down and the opportunities increase, the future is really amazing about what you could do with this type of technology. We're just not quite there yet.
Right. Anything? Or
I guess I would add one piece to that, and part of the public benefit, as Anna mentioned, like through papers or scientific research and bringing things out to the scientific community. But in a lot of the cases, as modifications are made to our algorithms or understanding basically from our research, we can also turn those discoveries back to customers. So if some new variant is found to tell you what stretch mark cream you should use or something, that those discoveries can be turned back to customers as well. And so I think that's also an exciting part.
So another question that is, what does the panel recommend to consumers who may test for conditions or susceptibility for which there are no good treatments? Alzheimer's, for example. Anyone want to tackle that one?
So as Andrew mentioned, we try to be very clear with our customers what they do and do not get. If at some point we have an Alzheimer's report that we are able to return, it would have passed the FDA clearance standards, and so at that point that's something we could return to them and then again provide the appropriate context for what do you do with this information. For people who want to do it right now, again, that's not something we offer. That's certainly something they can go to the doctor to do if they have the risk factors.
I would add to that too that there are, in a sense, 2 kinds of options, so to speak, or actions. There's things that are medically actionable, but there are also things that are personally actionable. And actually, Robert Green, you mentioned, has worked hard at trying to study people's reactions to finding out their Alzheimer's risks. And many of them, in fact, feel, obviously they're upset by realizing that they have a high risk for Alzheimer's, but ultimately they feel empowered by being able to make decisions in their lives that actually can help. It's not right for everybody, and this is a really important aspect about a lot of this. It's not the same answer of knowing your Alzheimer's risk is not the correct answer for everybody. Many people just simply don't want to know at all, and that's absolutely fine. And this is one of the challenges with this information. But in fact, there are things that even though right now Alzheimer's is not medically actionable, by and large, it is personally actionable, and that's something that is in fact turning out to be very true in a number of different cases where otherwise it would seem like there's just no alternative.
Yeah, point.
Okay. So a question here, which is a good one. Can insurance company use personal genetic data to refuse coverage because of a genetic predisposition toward a certain illness?
Sure. So to my knowledge, no. I guess the important thing to note is working at 23andMe, we don't share that information out. We take privacy extremely seriously, so we wouldn't share that out.
Yeah, and in the United States, we have the protections of GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, so insurance companies cannot use genetic information in that way.
Right, it's important to note that this Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act applies to health insurance and to employment for companies over a certain size. So it doesn't exempt everybody and everything. In fact, there's actually professional athletes, individuals that have, there's a variant of a hemoglobin that helps carry oxygen called sickle cell trait, and individuals that have that actually are sometimes prevented from competing at high altitudes in Denver or something like that, because they're at increased risk for basically blood clotting, and because of this sickle cell phenotype that can emerge. This is actually the basis for the testing of all Division 1, 2, and 3 athletes at all universities. So people don't realize this, but it's been going on for a number of years now, 6 or 7 years, that students, all Cornell athletes, and at Cornell about 10% of our students are in a Division I sport, and therefore that's basically 1,400 students every year that are submitting essentially genetic testing to be used by coaches and trainers to assure that those individuals are targeted with sufficient sort of hydration and watchfulness that they don't, in fact, have an episode associated with that particular variant. So I think we have to wrap up here, but I think the important point here is that this is a very exciting time. It's a point in which this particular science is, in fact, personal. It matters for you in terms of thinking about your own ancestry, and some of that aspect can be entertainment. Some of it can also be important for thinking ahead in terms of the kind of variants you may carry and may worry about passing on to your family, things that you can be proactive about. And also, though, in fact, being a participant in this actually really is going to continue to push the field forward, and the more people are unafraid of participating in these genetic testing approaches and clinical trials and other things, the more the benefit is going to feed back to society. And again, I want to emphasize that I think this is also a really important thing that we're trying to do very strongly at Cornell, is to get students to think broadly about this and engage in all the different kind of dimensions of the challenges in incorporating this information wisely into society. So with that, I'll stop, and I'll thank panelists here, and actually Julie Granka was actually one of my students in population genetics, so I have to confess that. So, but thank you all very much as well.